You're too slow to ever become somebody. My father told me the morning I turned 18, and for years I believed those words would follow me farther than my own shadow. My name is Ethan Walker, and if you had met me back then, you probably would have agreed with him. I wasn't the fastest student in class. I never had the quickest answer during conversations, and I always needed a little more time before making a decision. While other kids raised their hands the moment the teacher finished asking a question, I would still be thinking. While my older brother Ryan rushed forward with confidence, I stayed back, quietly making sure I understood every detail before taking a single step. To my parents, that wasn't careful. It was weakness. It became the label they gave me so often that eventually everyone else started using it too. At family dinners, Dad would laugh whenever I hesitated before answering something simple. "See," he'd say with a grin. "Ethan's still loading." Everyone around the table would chuckle, including Ryan, who never meant to be cruel, but had grown up believing that winning every race somehow made him better. Mom would smile awkwardly before changing the subject, but she never corrected Dad. She never once said, "Maybe he's just different." Instead, she would pat my shoulder and whisper, "You'll find your place someday." Somehow those words always sounded less like encouragement and more like sympathy. As the years passed, Ryan collected trophies, scholarships, promotions, and applause with what looked like effortless speed. Every holiday gathering became another opportunity for relatives to celebrate his latest achievement. Ryan closed another big deal. Ryan bought a beautiful new house. Ryan's company is expanding again. Every compliment floated across the room until someone eventually looked at me with that familiar expression people wear when they don't know what to say. "How about you, Ethan?" they would ask politely. Before I could answer, Dad usually did it for me. He's still figuring things out. The room would fill with gentle laughter. I'd smile because it was easier than explaining that I wasn't lost. I was simply moving at a pace no one else seemed willing to respect. I learned early that arguing never changed anyone's opinion. Every time I tried explaining why I preferred thinking before acting, Dad would shake his head. "Life rewards people who move fast," he'd say. "Nobody waits for the slow guy." After hearing that enough times, I stopped defending myself. I listened more than I spoke. I observed more than I reacted. People mistook my silence for insecurity, but silence has a strange way of teaching you things noise never can. I noticed who interrupted others without listening. I noticed who chased attention instead of purpose. I noticed how often people confused confidence with competence. Those observations became my quiet education, while everyone else was busy measuring success by speed alone. One Sunday evening, our family gathered at my parents' house for Ryan's latest celebration. He had just been promoted to regional vice president, and the dining room looked exactly as it always had during moments like these. Mom's homemade pot roast filled the air with familiar warmth. Framed family photographs lined the walls, and Ryan sat at the center of the table answering endless questions about business strategy, executive meetings, and future plans. I congratulated him sincerely because he had worked hard, and despite everything, I loved my brother. Then my father raised his glass. "Here's to Ryan," he announced proudly. Proof that hard work and quick thinking always win. Glasses clinked together. Everyone smiled. Then he looked directly at me. "Maybe some of that speed will rub off on your little brother someday." More laughter followed. I looked down at my plate, tracing circles along the edge with my fork. The mashed potatoes had already grown cold, but somehow that seemed appropriate. My aunt leaned toward me and tried to soften the moment. "Don't worry, Ethan," she said kindly. "Everyone blooms eventually." Dad chuckled again, hopefully before retirement. Even Mom laughed quietly this time, almost out of habit. Something inside me didn't break. It simply became very still. I realized I could spend another decade trying to earn approval that would always depend on someone else's definition of success, or I could stop asking for permission to become the person I wanted to be. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in my small apartment overlooking the quiet streets of Columbus. Rain tapped softly against the window while the city lights shimmered across the wet pavement below. My phone buzzed with another family group message full of smiling photos from dinner. Ryan stood in the center of every picture. I appeared near the edge of one image, half hidden behind a lamp, looking exactly the way I'd always felt inside my own family, present but unnoticed. I closed the photos without replying. Then I opened my laptop instead. On the screen waited an unfinished application that had been sitting there for weeks. When I had nearly convinced myself I wasn't qualified to submit, I read every line one last time, took a slow breath, and clicked the button marked Submit. The confirmation message appeared almost instantly, but something far more important happened inside me. For the first time in my life, I made a decision without wondering whether my parents would approve. They believed I was too slow to build a future worth admiring. They had no idea that sometimes the strongest foundations take the longest to lay, and the tallest names aren't written overnight. The email confirming that my application had been received did not promise anything remarkable. It did not congratulate me, guarantee an interview, or suggest that my future was about to change. It simply thanked me for applying and explained that the review process could take several weeks. Most people would have forgotten about it after closing the browser, but I stared at that message for several minutes because pressing that button had felt larger than submitting an application. It was the first decision I had made entirely for myself. The following Monday morning looked almost identical to every other Monday I had known. I woke up before sunrise, brewed a pot of coffee, packed a simple lunch, and drove 23 miles to the engineering firm where I worked as a junior analyst. My coworkers were friendly enough, although many of them shared the same first impression everyone else seemed to have. Because I spoke softly and rarely interrupted meetings, they assumed I lacked confidence. During brainstorming sessions, louder voices often filled the room before I had finished considering every angle of the problem. I learned not to compete with volume. Instead, I filled notebooks with observations, calculations, and questions that nobody else thought to ask. My supervisor, a thoughtful woman named Margaret Collins, was one of the few people who noticed. One afternoon, she stopped beside my desk carrying a stack of reports. "Ethan," she said, "how long did it take you to prepare this market analysis?" I shrugged. "About 3 days." She looked surprised. Everyone else estimated at least a week. I smiled politely. I spent most of the first day reading old project files before I started writing. Margaret nodded slowly. "That explains why you found the forecasting error nobody else caught." She walked away without another word, but that conversation stayed with me. For the first time in years, someone had complimented the result instead of criticizing the pace. Even then, I kept the exchange to myself. Whenever my family called, the conversations followed the same familiar pattern. Dad asked whether I had finally found a better position. Mom wanted to know if I was dating anyone. Ryan shared stories about conferences, promotions, and new clients. Then the questions always circled back to me. "Anything exciting happening at work?" Dad asked during one Sunday phone call. I looked around my apartment at the textbooks stacked beside my dining table, the online certification courses open on my laptop, and the notes covering my walls. There was plenty happening, but none of it sounded impressive yet. "I am learning a lot," I answered honestly. Dad laughed. "Learning is great. Just do not spend your whole life preparing." Ryan tried to ease the tension. "He will get there eventually." I thanked him even though the words landed like another reminder that everyone expected me to remain behind. After hanging up, I returned to studying. Most evenings followed the same routine. I finished work at 5:30, drove home. Through Columbus traffic, heated leftovers, and spent 4 or 5 hours reading technical journals, practicing presentation skills, or completing another certification module. Friday nights looked exactly like Tuesday nights. While coworkers posted photos from restaurants or sporting events, I highlighted research papers and practiced explaining complicated ideas in plain language. It was not glamorous, but every small improvement felt like placing another brick into a foundation nobody else could see. Months passed quietly. Seasons changed. Autumn leaves disappeared beneath winter snow, and winter slowly surrendered to spring rain. My life remained ordinary on the surface. I still drove the same aging sedan. I still rented the same modest apartment overlooking the same intersection where commuters hurried through yellow lights every morning. Nothing about my appearance suggested that anything important was happening. Yet inside, I felt different. I no longer measured progress by applause. I measured it by understanding. Each new skill connected with another until subjects that once seemed overwhelming became familiar. I realized that moving slowly had never been my weakness. Stopping would have been. One Saturday afternoon, Mom invited everyone over for her birthday lunch. The dining room looked brighter than usual, with fresh flowers covering the table and sunlight pouring through the windows. Ryan arrived carrying an expensive gift basket and immediately became the center of attention again. Dad proudly announced that Ryan had been invited to speak on a business leadership panel later that year. Everyone applauded. Then Dad turned toward me with an amused smile. "How about you, Ethan? Still reading all those books?" Before I could answer, Ryan said, "He has always liked learning." Dad chuckled. "Learning is wonderful, but eventually you have to step onto the field." I smiled politely and took another sip of iced tea. Nobody noticed that my phone vibrated quietly inside my pocket. I ignored it until lunch ended and everyone stepped outside to admire Mom's garden. Standing alone in the hallway, I unlocked the screen. The message came from the organization, where I had submitted my application months earlier. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. I had learned that important moments deserved calm attention. I opened the email and read every word twice. They wanted to schedule an interview. Not because someone had recommended me, not because of family connections, because they believed my work stood out on its own. I slipped the phone back into my pocket before anyone returned inside. Out in the backyard, Dad was explaining to a neighbor how Ryan had always been destined for leadership. Mom smiled proudly beside him. Neither of them realized that, for the first time in my life, a door had quietly opened without anyone else's permission. I looked across the yard at my family laughing together, and instead of feeling resentment, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. They were still looking at the person I used to be. I was already becoming someone they had never taken the time to know. The interview was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in Chicago, nearly 350 miles from my apartment in Columbus. I requested 2 vacation days from work, booked the least expensive hotel I could find within walking distance of the office, and spent the next 2 weeks preparing more carefully than I had ever prepared for anything in my life. Every evening, I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment practicing answers until they sounded natural instead of rehearsed. I studied the company's history, memorized recent projects, and read articles written by its senior leadership team. I knew I could not control who else would walk into that interview room, but I could control whether I arrived fully prepared. The night before I left, Dad called while I was ironing the only Navy suit I owned. "How are things?" he asked casually. "Pretty good," I replied. "I have an interview tomorrow." There was a brief pause before he asked, "For another analyst position?" I could have explained that it was part of a highly competitive leadership development program that accepted only a handful of applicants each year. Instead, I simply answered, something like that. Dad laughed softly. "Well, every step counts. Just do not expect miracles overnight." I smiled even though he could not see me. "I will keep that in mind." After we ended the call, I finished packing my suitcase without feeling the familiar disappointment. Years earlier, his words would have echoed in my head throughout the entire trip. Now they faded almost as quickly as the call itself. The drive to Chicago began before dawn. Interstate 90 was quiet except for long lines of tractor-trailers moving steadily through the darkness. I kept the radio off and allowed the silence to settle around me. For once, my thoughts were not filled with imaginary conversations or attempts to predict what other people expected from me. I simply focused on the road ahead, mile after mile, feeling strangely calm. By late morning, I arrived at the company's headquarters, a modern glass building overlooking the Chicago River. Employees moved confidently through the lobby carrying laptops and coffee cups, while visitors studied the digital directory near the entrance. My reflection stared back at me from the polished marble floor. The same quiet man my family believed would always struggle to keep up was standing in one of the most respected firms in the country, invited there because complete strangers believed he deserved a chance. That realization gave me more confidence than any motivational speech ever could. A receptionist greeted me warmly and directed me to a waiting area where 6 other candidates had already gathered. Some wore expensive tailored suits. Others spoke confidently about graduate schools, international projects, and previous management experience. Years ago, I would have listened to those conversations and convinced myself that I did not belong. Instead, I opened my notebook and reviewed a few handwritten reminders. Listen carefully. Think before answering. Do not rush simply because everyone else does. When my name was called, I followed a human resources manager into a conference room where 3 interviewers waited around a large oak table. The first questions were straightforward. They asked about my work experience, the projects I enjoyed most, and why I had applied. Then one executive slid a folder across the table. containing a complex business case filled with financial projections and operational challenges. Most candidates begin answering immediately, she explained. Take whatever time you need. I spent several minutes reading every page without saying a word. I noticed one interviewer glance toward another as if wondering whether I had frozen under pressure. Finally, I looked up and smiled. Before I answer, I said, I think there are two assumptions in these numbers that deserve another look. The room became completely quiet. I carefully explained how a small forecasting error created unrealistic expectations throughout the entire proposal. Then I described an alternative approach that balanced long-term sustainability with realistic growth. Nobody interrupted. When I finished, the executive who had handed me the folder leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. You are the first applicant today who questioned the assumptions instead of trying to solve the wrong problem. Another interviewer asked why I had waited so long before speaking. I answered honestly. I have spent most of my life being told I move too slowly. Eventually, I realized that taking time to understand the right question often matters more than producing the fastest answer. None of them smiled immediately. Instead, they wrote notes while the room remained silent. For the first time, silence felt like respect instead of judgment. The interview continued for another hour, touching on leadership, teamwork, communication, and difficult decisions. I never tried to sound impressive. Whenever I did not know something, I admitted it plainly before explaining how I would find the answer. As I left the building that afternoon, the skyline reflected across the river in shimmering waves beneath the spring sunshine. I had no idea whether I would receive an offer, but I experienced something even more valuable. For 2 hours, nobody had compared me with Ryan. Nobody had reminded me that I was slower than everyone else. They evaluated only my ideas, my character, and the way I approached problems. During the drive home, my phone rang through the car speakers. It was Ryan. Mom said you had an interview. He said, how did it go? I smiled as the highway stretched endlessly ahead. I honestly do not know, I replied. But for the first time, I think I finally showed people exactly who I am. Ryan paused before answering in a quieter voice than usual. That sounds like it went better than you were letting on. I looked toward the horizon where the afternoon sun painted the clouds with shades of gold. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I just stopped trying to be the person everyone else expected and started being myself instead. The email arrived 9 days after my interview, just before 7 o'clock on a quiet Friday morning. I was pouring coffee into my favorite blue mug when my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. At first I ignored it, assuming it was another promotional message or an automated reminder from my bank. Only after I sat down at the small table beside the window did I unlock the screen. The sender's name immediately caught my attention. My heart did not race the way it would have years earlier. Instead, everything around me seemed to slow down. I opened the message carefully and read every sentence from beginning to end. Then I read it again just to make sure I had not misunderstood. They were offering me a place in their leadership development program. Out of hundreds of applicants from across the country, I had been selected. I placed the phone on the table and simply stared through the window as the first rays of sunlight reached the rooftops across the street. There was no dramatic celebration, no shouting, no victory dance, just an overwhelming feeling that years of quiet effort had finally been seen by someone who had no reason to favor me except the quality of my work. After a few minutes, I called Margaret before anyone else. She answered on the second ring. Good morning, Ethan. I received the offer, I said softly. There was a brief silence before she laughed with genuine happiness. I knew you would. They would have been foolish to let you get away. I thanked her for believing in me long before I believed in myself. She reminded me that opportunities like this rarely happen by accident. People think confidence creates success, she said. Sometimes consistency does. Those words stayed with me long after the call ended. Giving notice at my current job turned out to be more emotional than I expected. Margaret congratulated me in front of the entire department, and several coworkers admitted they had underestimated how much responsibility I had quietly carried over the past few years. One colleague even smiled and said, I guess you were paying attention while the rest of us were trying to sound smart. We both laughed because there was no bitterness in his voice, only honesty. During my final week, I organized every project, documented every process, and made sure the person replacing me would have everything needed to succeed. Margaret noticed the extra effort and asked why I was spending so much time helping after already accepting another position. I smiled. Someone once gave me a chance. The least I can do is leave things better than I found them. She nodded with quiet approval. A month later, I packed my apartment into a rented moving truck and drove back to Chicago, this time not as a visitor, but as someone beginning an entirely new chapter. The company arranged temporary housing near downtown, while the program participants completed orientation. There were 12 of us in total, representing different states, universities, and professional backgrounds. Some had impressive resumes filled with prestigious internships and graduate degrees. Others had started small businesses or managed large teams. Listening to their stories during the first few days could have made me feel intimidated, but something inside me had changed. I no longer measured my value against the accomplishments of people sitting beside me. Instead, I focused on learning from them while offering my own perspective whenever I believed it could help. During one workshop, our instructor divided us into teams and assigned a complex operational challenge with only 90 minutes to produce a solution. Predictably, several people immediately began debating possible answers. Voices overlapped as everyone tried to establish leadership. I quietly filled pages with notes, mapping relationships between different variables while the discussion continued around me. About halfway through the exercise, one teammate finally turned toward me. "Ethan," she asked, "you have barely said anything. What are you thinking?" I looked at the whiteboard covered with half-finished ideas before answering. "I think we are solving 3 different problems at the same time." The room became quiet. I walked to the board, erased a section, and redrew the framework from the beginning. Once everyone focused on the actual root issue, the solution became surprisingly clear. After we finished, the instructor smiled as he reviewed our presentation. "Interesting," he said. "Most groups rushed toward complexity. Your team simplified the problem first." One of my teammates laughed and pointed at me. That was his idea. It was the first time strangers associated my careful pace with leadership instead of hesitation. Weeks gradually turned into months. I learned from experienced executives, participated in major projects, and earned responsibilities that once seemed impossible to imagine. My confidence grew quietly, not because people praised me every day, but because I repeatedly proved to myself that I belonged in those rooms. Meanwhile, life back home continued almost exactly as before. Ryan accepted another promotion. Dad proudly shared every update with relatives during family phone calls. Mom occasionally asked whether I was enjoying Chicago, and I always answered honestly. "I am learning a lot." She smiled through the phone and replied, "I am glad you finally found something that fits you." She still had no idea what I was actually doing. Neither did Dad. I never hid my work from them, but I stopped feeling the need to explain every milestone to people who had already decided who I was years earlier. Their image of me remained frozen in the past, while my real life kept moving forward one steady step at a time. Then, almost a year after I had arrived in Chicago, an email appeared in my inbox with the subject line announcing the company's annual leadership summit. Executives, investors, partners, and industry leaders from across the country would gather for 3 days of presentations and strategic planning. Every participant in the leadership program was expected to attend. I opened the agenda out of simple curiosity, scanning through the list of speakers until my eyes stopped on a familiar name. Ryan Walker. His company had been invited to present a case study during one of the afternoon sessions. I smiled, genuinely happy for him. Then I continued scrolling through the schedule, unaware that before the summit was over, our family would witness something none of us could have imagined. I kept scrolling through the summit agenda until I reached the opening session scheduled for the first morning. My eyes paused for a moment, not because I recognized another familiar name, but because I recognized the title of the keynote presentation. It was almost identical to a strategic proposal I had spent months helping develop with one of our executive teams. At the bottom of the description, the speaker's name had not yet been published. Instead, it simply read, "To be announced." I closed my laptop without giving it much thought. In large organizations, keynote assignments often changed until the very last minute. The following week became one of the busiest periods since I had joined the program. Teams finalized presentations, executives rehearsed speeches, and conference planners seemed to be everywhere throughout the headquarters. I focused on my assigned responsibilities without asking questions about the keynote. If someone needed my help, I gave it. If they did not, I continued working quietly behind the scenes. That had become my habit long before anyone began noticing my contributions. 3 days before the summit, I received an invitation to meet with our senior vice president, Daniel Harper. His assistant simply asked me to stop by his office after lunch. I assumed it involved one of our ongoing projects. Instead, after welcoming me inside, Daniel closed the door and motioned toward the chair across from his desk. "Ethan," he began with a relaxed smile, "how comfortable are you speaking in front of large audiences?" I laughed softly. "Comfortable enough if I know the subject." He nodded. "Good answer." Then he slid a folder across the desk. Inside was the finalized summit agenda. This time, the keynote speaker section was complete. My own name appeared beneath the presentation title. I looked at the page for several seconds without speaking. Finally, I glanced back at Daniel, convinced there had been some mistake. "I think you gave me the wrong copy." He smiled. "No, I did not." I looked at the agenda again. "There are vice presidents here with 20 years of experience." "There are," he agreed. "And several of them recommended you." I felt completely unprepared for that answer. Daniel leaned back in his chair before continuing. "During the past year, I have watched you solve problems that other people complicated. I have watched you earn respect without demanding attention. You remind people that leadership is not measured by how loudly someone speaks. It is measured by how clearly others begin thinking after hearing them." I remained silent, searching for the right response. "I have never given a keynote before," I admitted. "Exactly," he replied. "Which means you will prepare for it instead of assuming you already know how." Walking back to my office that afternoon, I folded the printed agenda carefully and placed it inside my notebook. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I needed time to accept it myself before sharing it with anyone else. That evening, Ryan called unexpectedly. "Guess what?" he asked enthusiastically. "Our company is presenting at the Leadership Summit in Chicago next month." I smiled. "I saw the schedule today. Congratulations. Mom and Dad are thinking about coming since the event allows family guests. They have never seen one of these conferences before." "That sounds nice," I replied honestly. Ryan continued describing his presentation while I listened with genuine interest. Several times I almost mentioned my own role, but something stopped me. Not fear, not insecurity, simply the feeling that some moments become more meaningful when they reveal themselves naturally. There was no need to announce what would soon become obvious. A few days later, Mom called while I was walking home from work along the Chicago River. "Ryan told us about the summit," she said excitedly. "Your father already booked flights." "That is wonderful," I answered. "It will be good to see everyone." She asked where I would be sitting during Ryan's presentation. "Probably somewhere in the audience," I replied. Technically, it was true. My keynote would take place several hours earlier. She laughed warmly. "Make sure you cheer loudly for your brother." "I always do," I said. After the call ended, I stood for a moment watching tour boats glide slowly across the water beneath the evening sunlight. It occurred to me that my family still believed they understood exactly where I belonged. In every story they imagined about the upcoming conference, Ryan naturally occupied the center while I quietly applauded from the crowd. I did not resent them for believing that. After all, I had spent most of my life standing in the background. They had simply never noticed that while they were watching one path unfold, another had been taking shape beyond their view. During the weeks leading up to the summit, I refined every slide, practiced every transition, and timed every section until the presentation flowed naturally without feeling memorized. Daniel attended several rehearsal sessions and rarely interrupted. At the end of the final practice, he gathered the executive team and asked whether anyone had concerns. The room remained completely silent. Then Margaret, who had traveled from Columbus after accepting a senior position within the company months earlier, smiled proudly from the back of the room. "He is ready," she said. Daniel nodded once before looking directly at me. "Then all that remains is for everyone else to discover what we already know." As I left the conference room carrying my notebook beneath one arm, I passed workers installing enormous digital display screens throughout the convention center lobby. One technician tested the system by loading sample graphics onto the largest screen above the main entrance. In just a few days, thousands of guests would walk beneath those displays without realizing that one name scheduled to appear there would quietly rewrite the story my family had believed for almost my entire life. The morning of the Leadership Summit arrived, with the kind of calm that only comes after months of preparation. I woke before my alarm, opened the curtains of my apartment, and watched the first lights spread across the Chicago skyline. Instead of rehearsing my presentation one last time, I made a cup of coffee and sat quietly by the window. There was nothing left to memorize. Every chart, every story, every lesson had already become part of me. For years I had believed that confidence came from knowing exactly what would happen next. Now I understood that real confidence came from trusting the work I had already done. By 7:30, I walked into the convention center carrying only my laptop and a leather notebook that had followed me through every stage of this journey. The lobby was already alive with conversations. Executives greeted longtime colleagues, sponsors welcomed guests, and volunteers guided attendees toward registration desks. Massive digital displays stretched across the entrance hall, cycling through the day's schedule, company logos, and featured speakers. I greeted several members of our leadership team before making my way backstage, where Daniel Harper met me with his usual steady smile. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Ready," I answered honestly. He nodded once. "Good. Do not try to impress anyone today. Just tell the truth about what you have learned. That is why you were chosen." His words settled every remaining trace of nervousness. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message from Mom. "We just arrived. Ryan says his session is after lunch. We cannot wait to see him." I smiled as I read it and replied with only 4 words. "I am glad you came." She responded with a heart emoji and nothing more. They still believed they were attending to watch Ryan. I did not feel disappointed by that anymore. Sometimes life revealed its biggest surprises without any help. At 8:45, I stepped behind the stage curtain while technicians completed final sound checks. Through a narrow opening, I could see hundreds of attendees taking their seats. Then I noticed 4 familiar figures entering from the back of the ballroom. Dad walked confidently beside Mom, while Ryan pointed toward the front rows reserved for presenters and invited guests. They were laughing together, completely unaware that they had arrived only minutes before the opening session. An event coordinator welcomed them, scanned their guest badges, and directed them towards seats near the center of the room. From where I stood backstage, I could see them clearly, but they could not see me. Dad looked around with obvious excitement. He leaned toward Ryan and said something that made all 3 of them smile. I imagined he was talking about Ryan's presentation later that afternoon. Moments later, the ballroom lights dimmed. Soft music filled the room as the enormous center screen illuminated with the conference logo. A master of ceremonies walked onto the stage, welcomed everyone, thanked the sponsors, and spoke briefly about innovation, leadership, and long-term vision. Then he paused and smiled toward the audience. "To begin this year's summit," he announced, "we are honored to introduce a leader whose thoughtful approach to solving complex challenges has already begun shaping the future of our organization. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker." Behind the curtain, I took one slow breath. The giant screen changed. Large white letters appeared against a deep blue background. "Ethan Walker." Beneath my name appeared the title of my presentation. For a brief moment, the entire ballroom became perfectly still. I heard no applause, no conversation, only silence. I looked through the narrow opening in the curtain again. Dad was staring at the screen without moving. Mom looked back and forth between the display and the printed agenda in her hands as though she believed she had picked up the wrong program. Ryan's eyes widened with unmistakable surprise before a slow smile spread across his face. Unlike the others, he understood immediately. He turned toward our parents and quietly pointed toward the stage just as my name was announced again. Then the applause began. It started with our executive team standing together near the front, followed by hundreds of attendees rising to their feet. The sound filled every corner of the ballroom. I walked onto the stage at a steady pace, smiling politely as I thanked the audience. The bright lights made it difficult to see individual faces, but I found my family almost immediately. Dad remained frozen in his seat, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and confusion. Mom had one hand covering her mouth. Ryan was already standing, applauding with genuine pride. For just a second, our eyes met across the room. He gave me a small nod that said more than words ever could. I returned the gesture before stepping to the podium. Looking across the audience, I realized something remarkable. Nobody in that room knew me as the slow kid from family dinners. Nobody knew the jokes, the comparisons, or the years spent standing quietly at the edge of every celebration. They knew me only as the person invited to deliver the opening keynote because my work had earned that privilege. It was the first time in my life that I stood before an audience completely free from someone else's expectations. I thanked everyone for attending and began speaking about leadership, thoughtful decision-making, and the hidden value of slowing down long enough to understand the real problem before chasing the quickest solution. Every story I shared came from lessons learned through experience rather than theory. Every example reflected moments when patience had produced stronger results than urgency. The audience listened with complete attention. Some nodded as they took notes. Others smiled during moments of quiet humor. Occasionally, I glanced toward my family. Dad never looked away from the stage. Mom listened with tears quietly gathering in her eyes. Ryan continued smiling in a way I had never seen before, not because his younger brother had finally become successful, but because for the first time he was seeing the person I had been becoming all along. At that moment, I understood that the greatest surprise waiting inside that ballroom was never my promotion, my position, or even my name displayed above the stage. It was the realization that the quiet son they had spent years trying to hurry had arrived exactly where he was always meant to be, simply by refusing to move at anyone else's speed. When the applause finally faded, I stepped away from the podium with the same steady pace that had carried me through every important moment in my life. Several executives greeted me backstage with warm handshakes and sincere congratulations. Daniel Harper smiled as though the outcome had never been in doubt. "You did exactly what I hoped you would do," he said. "You made people think instead of simply giving them something to hear." Margaret stood beside him with unmistakable pride in her eyes. "I told you years ago that consistency mattered more than confidence," she said. Today, everyone else finally saw it. I thanked both of them before an event coordinator reminded me that the networking reception would begin in a nearby ballroom. Dozens of attendees were already waiting to introduce themselves, ask questions about the presentation, and exchange ideas. For nearly an hour, I moved from one conversation to another. Senior leaders discussed future projects. Young professionals thanked me for encouraging thoughtful leadership, and several business owners admitted they had spent years believing that making faster decisions automatically meant making better ones. One man in his 60s shook my hand firmly before saying, "Your presentation reminded me of the best mentor I ever had. He always said that rushing usually creates more work than patience." Hearing those words from a complete stranger meant more than I could have explained. None of these people knew my family history. They judged only the work standing in front of them. As the crowd gradually began moving toward the afternoon sessions, I noticed Ryan standing quietly near the entrance waiting for me. He was still wearing his conference badge, but instead of immediately speaking, he simply smiled. "I was wondering when I would get a chance to congratulate you," he said. "That was incredible." I thanked him, and for a moment we stood together in comfortable silence. Then he laughed softly. "You know what is funny? I always thought you were thinking about 10 different things while everyone else rushed ahead. Turns out you actually were." There was no jealousy in his voice, only honest admiration. "I never saw it that way before," he admitted. "I should have." I smiled. "You had your own path to follow. I had mine." He nodded thoughtfully before glancing across the room. "Mom and Dad are looking for you." I followed his gaze and immediately spotted them standing several yards away. Mom held the printed conference agenda tightly against her chest. Dad stood beside her with his hands folded in front of him, looking more uncertain than I had ever seen him. Ryan gently placed a hand on my shoulder before walking toward his own presentation room, giving us space to talk. Mom reached me first. Without saying a word, she wrapped her arms around me in a long embrace. When she finally stepped back, her eyes were wet with quiet tears. "Why did you never tell us?" she asked softly. I smiled with genuine kindness. "You never asked." She lowered her eyes for a moment, and I could almost see years of family conversations passing through her memory. Every dinner, every holiday, every time she had accepted someone else's opinion about who I was instead of discovering it for herself. Dad remained silent for several more seconds before speaking. I do not know what to say. It was the first time in my life I had heard those words from him. The man who always seemed to have an answer suddenly had none. I did not rush to fill the silence. Eventually, he looked directly at me. I spent years believing that if someone moved quickly, they would automatically go farther. I think I confused speed with direction. His voice carried no excuses, only quiet honesty. "I kept waiting for you to catch up." I shook my head gently. Dad, I was never trying to run the same race. He looked down at the conference program still folded in his hand. My name appeared at the top of the page above every session scheduled that morning. He traced the letters briefly with his thumb before looking back at me. I think I spent so much time celebrating the son I thought was winning that I forgot to notice the son who was quietly becoming extraordinary. Those words could have satisfied the younger version of me who had desperately wanted recognition. Instead, I felt something different. Peace. Not because my father had finally changed his opinion, but because his opinion no longer determined my value. I never wanted to compete with Ryan, I said calmly. I just wanted to become the best version of myself. Dad nodded slowly. I know that now. Mom reached for my hand. We are proud of you. Years earlier, those words would have felt like the ending I had always hoped for. Instead, they simply felt like the beginning of a more honest relationship. I smiled warmly. Thank you. There was no anger left to release, no score to settle, no dramatic speech waiting inside me. The greatest victory had already happened long before this conference. It happened the day I stopped measuring my future by someone else's expectations. A volunteer approached to remind everyone that the afternoon sessions were about to begin, including Ryan's presentation. Dad looked toward the hallway leading to the next ballroom before turning back to me. Will you come watch your brother? He asked. I smiled. Of course. We walked together through the convention center, not as a family trying to decide which son mattered more, but as four people finally beginning to understand that success had never required choosing between us. As Ryan stepped onto the stage later that afternoon, I applauded with the same sincerity I always had. This time, when I looked toward my parents, they were not watching only one son. For the first time that I could remember, they were looking at both of us with equal pride, and somehow that quiet moment meant even more than seeing my own name illuminated across the largest screen in the building. The conference ended that evening, but something much more important than a successful presentation had only just begun. Over the next several weeks, life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, yet nothing felt quite the same. I returned to my office in Chicago, resumed working with my team, and continued approaching each project the way I always had, one thoughtful decision at a time. The excitement surrounding the summit gradually faded for everyone else, but its impact quietly settled into everyday life. One Monday morning, Daniel Harper stopped by my office carrying 2 folders. He placed them on my desk. Before taking a seat across from me, I have a question, he said. Do you remember what you told the audience during your keynote? I smiled. Probably not every word. He laughed. You said that the strongest leaders are not always the first to speak. Sometimes they are the ones who help everyone else ask better questions. I nodded. I remember that. He slid one of the folders toward me. Several divisions have requested your help on long-term strategy initiatives. We would like you to lead one of them. I looked down at the proposal, realizing that another door had quietly opened. I appreciate the opportunity, I said. I will do everything I can to earn it. Daniel smiled. That is exactly why we offered it to you. A few days later, while reviewing project schedules, my phone rang. It was Mom. Instead of asking how work was going in the casual way she always had before, she surprised me with a different question. What are you working on these days? She asked. There was genuine curiosity in her voice. Not polite conversation. Real interest. I spent several minutes explaining the project, the challenges my team was solving, and why careful planning often saved companies millions of dollars over time. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said something I had never heard before. I wish I had asked those questions years ago. Her words lingered in my mind long after we ended the call. Sometimes healing begins with something as simple as finally listening. Family dinners also began to change. A month after the summit, I drove back to Columbus for another Sunday gathering at my parents' house. The dining room looked exactly as it always had. The same photographs hung on the walls. The same wooden table stood beneath the dining room light. Mom served her famous pot roast with mashed potatoes, green beans, and homemade rolls. For years that room had been filled with comparisons I could never seem to win. This time felt different from the moment I walked through the front door. Dad greeted me with a warm smile instead of a joke. Ryan asked thoughtful questions about Chicago before sharing updates about his own work. Even the conversation itself seemed slower, as though everyone had unconsciously decided that no one needed to compete for attention anymore. Halfway through dinner, my aunt asked what I had been doing since the conference. Before I could answer, Dad looked toward her and smiled proudly. Ethan has been leading some important projects. There was no exaggeration in his voice and no attempt to make my accomplishments sound larger than they were. He simply stated the truth. Then he turned toward me. Tell everyone about the work you are doing. It was a small moment, one that most people around the table probably forgot within minutes. But I noticed it immediately. For the first time in my life, Dad did not answer for me. He invited me to speak for myself. Later that evening, after everyone else had left, I helped him carry empty serving dishes into the kitchen. We worked quietly side by side for several minutes before he finally broke the silence. Do you remember telling me that you were never running the same race as Ryan? He asked. I do. He rinsed another plate before setting it carefully into the dishwasher. I have thought about that almost every day since the conference. I waited without saying anything. Parents spend so much time worrying about whether their children are keeping up that sometimes we forget to ask whether they are heading toward the life that actually fits them. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, one that carried humility instead of certainty. I was so focused on speed that I never appreciated your patience. I smiled gently. You taught me to work hard. I just learned that I had to do it in my own way. He nodded. I am still learning that lesson myself. As I drove back to Chicago the following morning, I thought about how strange life could be. For years, I believed that proving people wrong would feel like crossing a finish line. Instead, it felt more like setting down a weight I had carried for far too long. Success had not erased the difficult memories. It had simply placed them into a larger story where they no longer controlled the ending. My parents had changed, but even if they never had, I finally understood something. That would stay with me for the rest of my life. Real confidence is not built on applause, promotions, or impressive titles. It grows quietly every time you continue moving forward without demanding immediate recognition. Some people bloom early, others bloom later. Neither path is better. The only mistake is believing that someone else's timetable should become your own. Looking back, I realized that every moment when I had been called slow had actually been teaching me endurance. Every comparison had taught me independence. Every overlooked achievement had taught me to find satisfaction in the work itself instead of the attention surrounding it. Those lessons became the foundation beneath every opportunity that followed. And for the first time, I truly appreciated the pace that had once made me question my own worth. Several years have passed since that conference, yet people still ask me what it felt like to see my name projected across that enormous screen while my family sat in the audience. They usually expect me to describe the excitement, the surprise, or the satisfaction of finally proving everyone wrong. The truth is much quieter than that. By the time my name appeared there, the most important victory had already happened. It happened on an ordinary evening in my small apartment when I stopped asking whether I was moving fast enough to satisfy someone else's expectations. Everything that followed grew from that single decision. My career continued to develop in ways I never imagined when I was younger. I accepted greater responsibilities, led larger teams, and eventually became responsible for mentoring young professionals entering our leadership program. Every new group reminded me a little of myself. There was always someone who apologized before speaking, someone who believed they needed to answer immediately to appear intelligent, and someone who quietly questioned whether they truly belonged in the room. Whenever I noticed that uncertainty, I remembered the countless times I had been told I was too slow. Instead of teaching those new employees how to become louder, I encouraged them to become more thoughtful. Instead of asking for quick answers, I asked better questions. Instead of rewarding the first idea offered, I challenged them to discover the strongest one. Slowly, our team developed a reputation for solving difficult problems without unnecessary drama. Clients appreciated our careful planning because it prevented expensive mistakes before they happened. Colleagues began describing our department as dependable rather than flashy. Every time I heard those words, I smiled because I understood something they did not. The qualities people admired most were the same qualities others had once criticized. My relationship with Ryan also grew stronger than it had ever been. Without the constant comparisons hanging over us, we discovered that we had never actually been rivals. We had simply been placed into roles we never chose. Whenever our schedules allowed, we met for lunch, talked about work, family, and life, and occasionally laughed about childhood memories that seemed completely different now. One afternoon, he admitted something that surprised me. "Do you know what I envied about you?" he asked. I looked at him with genuine curiosity. I always thought you had everything figured out, I said. He laughed and shook his head. Not even close. I envied the fact that you never chased other people's approval the way I did. I smiled. It took me a long time to stop chasing it. He nodded thoughtfully. It took me even longer to realize I was chasing it at all. Our parents changed in quieter ways than anyone outside our family would ever notice. Dad stopped introducing me by explaining what I was working toward and started talking about the person I had become. Mom developed a habit of calling simply to ask how I was doing instead of asking whether I had accomplished something new. Those conversations became some of my favorite moments because they were no longer built around achievement. They were built around understanding. Looking back now, I do not blame my parents for believing that speed determined success. They grew up in a world that celebrated quick results, rapid promotions, and visible accomplishments. They wanted the best for both of their sons. They simply misunderstood what best looked like. For me, once I accepted that, forgiveness became surprisingly easy. Forgiveness did not erase the past, but it allowed all of us to build something healthier than what we had before. Every now and then I still visit the convention center in Chicago where that leadership summit took place. The displays have changed, the stages have been redesigned, and thousands of new faces have walked through those halls since then. Most of them have no idea that one ordinary morning changed the direction of an entire family. Whenever I stand there, I do not picture my own name on the giant screen anymore. I picture my father sitting quietly in the audience as he realized that the son he worried about had never been falling behind. He had simply been traveling at the pace that allowed him to become exactly who he was meant to be. If someone listening to my story feels like they are always one step behind everyone else, I hope they remember this. Life is not a race measured by who reaches each milestone first. Some dreams require longer seasons of preparation. Some strengths become visible only after years of patient effort. Some people need extra time because they are building something that will last instead of something that only looks impressive for a moment. Never confuse another person's speed with your own potential. Never believe that quiet progress is the same as failure. The people around you may not always understand your path, and sometimes even those who love you will misjudge where you are headed. Let them have their opinions if they must, but do not let those opinions become your future. Keep learning. Keep improving. Keep showing up even when nobody is applauding. One day you will look back and realize that every slow step carried you somewhere worth reaching. I used to believe that success meant hearing my parents finally say they were proud of me. Today I know that success began the moment I became proud of the person I was becoming, even before anyone else noticed. Everything after that was simply the world catching up.